Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second Scale by the Bay panel. As you know, we kind of do really interesting panels of really interesting folks, and I'm really happy to introduce the Startup and ML Machine Learning and AI Landscape panel today. I'm Alexy Khrabrov. I'm the founder and organizer of Scale by the Bay, also run by Merity AI, which is one of the oldest AI meetups, which actually was the very first, I think, NLP meetup until everything by law has to become AI, right? So we still remember, if you remember, data mining and things like that, information retrieval even. We have a great panel with us today. We have James Cham from Bloomberg Beta. We have Merity, who is Stephen Merity, but goes by Merity. And we have Lisha from Rosebud. And Merity was at Salesforce and MetaMind, and before that, he was actually one of the first speakers at By the Bay events. He was a speaker at Text by the Bay in 2015. This was the very first AI branch of By the Bay events. So we started before, again, AI became fashionable to the extent as it is today. And he actually talked about command crawl. Basically, I think that's very indicative of the theme we have here, which is big scale engineering feeding AI, right? It's not about notebooks and just kind of math. It's really about how to make things work at scale and build businesses with it, which work at scale. So that's kind of the origins of this. And now I'll just invite you guys to introduce yourselves. And for the audience, feel free to ask questions in Discord. We have volunteers who will relay these questions to me, and I will keep an eye on them. So when they fit, I will fit, the questions asked of the panelists. You can address them to all of them. You can address them to individual panelists. All right, so welcome, guys. So I had the order here, James, Lisha, and Merity. So please introduce yourself in that order. James first.
I am James Cham. I'm a seed stage VC at a firm called Bloomberg Beta, where we invest in, I don't know, whatever, the future of work. But because we started about 8 years ago, I got lucky and got to sort of be early at a bunch of machine learning infrastructure companies. And so I'm an investor in companies like, initially Crowdflower, then Weights and Biases, Fiddler, Streamlit, whatever it is that Merity is going to do and stuff like that. And then I think that the exciting thing about the time that we're in right now is that we're just at the point where people sort of no longer believe in magic and are mildly disillusioned, and thus see the massive opportunities of things that you can build with machine learning. And I'm especially excited to hear what Lisha thinks, in part because she not only comes from academia, but also was briefly a VC, was smart enough to decide to take the jump and start a company, and then she's pivoted and learned. And so I'm very excited now to turn this over to her as she introduces herself, even though I've stolen most of her thunder.
Oh, no worries at all. Thank you, James. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it was a smart jump, but it was definitely something driven by a need to build, this particular product. So I had a lot of fun being a VC. Hi, everyone. My name is Lisha. I am the founder and CEO of Rosebud AI. We are, in a one-liner, a synthetic media platform for creators. And what that encompasses is really, what galvanized me to build Rosebud. There's a lot of stellar research coming out of deep learning in particular that made content creation, more specifically visual content creation, far more accessible and potentially a lot more intuitive. This doesn't maybe use the traditional computer graphics pipeline and relied on a lot of just novel architectures that can produce images and videos and motions that were, either stunningly real or extremely fantastical, but really artistically beautiful. So, I think what was really interesting to me about this tech was also that, mainly obviously in the early days stemmed from academia, but it needed to be molded into a product. And so there's that relationship between getting the right data from users, thinking about the interface and how you can reveal certain complexities to the user and make it, almost stupidly easy. So it's actually a charming product to use. And so I have a lot of fun basically thinking about that every day, building Rosebud.
And I have, and so I wasn't just joking that I'm actually genuinely looking forward to sort of interrogating some of the process you went through, because I think it's going to be true for many of the folks in this audience as far as your ability to pick interesting research, right? And then sort of find an interesting problem and then create an interesting product and then a business model. And I feel like in part because you come from a unique intersection of academia and entrepreneurship and sort of NBC, you'll have really smart points. And hopefully good learnings for everyone. Although the real quest will be, will you make something as valuable and entertaining and as important as crawling the entire web?
Cue Merity.
So hello, yes, my name is Stephen Merity, and I've had a kind of fun history along this path. As Alexy mentioned, I was one of the earliest Text by the Bay speakers, and that was when I was working at Common Crawl. And it turns out Common Crawl, we were trying to crawl all of the web, kind of provide a competitor for someone like Google, give this data to startups and academics without them having to get their own crawling infrastructure. Turns out that was very useful for text analysis. So I ended up trawling towards a startup at the time called MetaMind, where we did very early pioneering work in language modeling, when in the earliest papers I had, they replied with, language modeling, very cool, but like it's completely useless to any practical application. Things have proceeded since then. MetaMind was acquired by Salesforce. And basically in that time, I was an AI researcher. I worked a lot of new neural network architectures, mainly for language modeling. And at some point, I decided to go off, leap into the darkness and try my own startup as well. And thankfully, I was supported by Bloomberg Beta and James Cham specifically. And I'm kind of on a path, as he mentioned, of trying to find what research is out there, working out what the problem is, pushing it towards product, and seeing if you can get a business model established at the same time. And for me, it's been especially interesting because I think language is like humanity's longest running program, in that we have put all of this compute into it, it's cached all of this like knowledge and thought that we've done, and we're really just scratching the surface of it. And the fact that language modeling is now expanding to other modalities is especially interesting to me. But the real problem, and the reason I went from a researcher to out in the real world, is that if you think of the language modeling tech that we had even 2, 3, 4 years ago, most people on Earth still don't have anything like that. The best they might run into is like Gmail autocomplete or the text completion they have on their phone. And it seems like there's a very large gap just waiting to be filled. And that's a very different problem than scaling to 175 billion parameters, as many of these companies are doing.
Thank you guys. This was an amazing introduction. And I just want to kind of emphasize another theme. So this is scaled by the Bay, right? And in physical real world, we actually are in the 9th year of running these 7 first years. We're actually running different locations by the Bay. The first was in Santa Clara at an Intel building, which it donated to us. And I think we charged $70 for snacks and coffee, which seemed like an outrageous sum then to self-sustain. And then we kind of grew. And last time we were in Auckland in a beautiful Masonic temple on the shores of Lake Merritt. I really hope, we come back. And we were at Fort Mason on a pier, and Bloomberg Beta is located on another pier. And you can pass by it if you go to Exploratorium with your kids or friends. And Lisha, I think, hails from Berkeley, right, which is a local famous place, and folks come from Stanford. So we really, I think, are at the epicenter of intersection of research, startup, and community, right? I think the community is a very strong theme here. And, the Internet Archive is in San Francisco, also, had a fun, time visiting Brewster there. So I think we really kind of, it's not for nothing. We gather here by the Bay virtually, and I really hope we reconvene. So we have a plan for the next year to summon food trucks near Fort Mason, probably. So I really hope, if you're watching this, that you make some plans to be here in reality. And I would actually like to kind of, start with these themes. So what's really interesting about this panel, that we have, so-called deep tech founders, right? So, and obviously, coming from research, spaces, it's a non-trivial endeavor. So MetaMind, I think, started with a Stanford founder. And by the way, right, so MetaMind, I think we signed up Richard Stocher to keynote Scale by the Bay when he was still MetaMind, and two companies which basically submitted talks were acquired in between CFP and the conference. So I really recommend highly that you guys submit talks to our future conferences. It's a very strong signal in that sense. So, right, so, but we really have here, and the Salesforce forced these research labs, right? And I think I heard first about attention in deep learning from Merity at the rooftop of AI by the Bay. So it was all new, right? It all happened in 4 years. The whole NLP area was defenestrated. All the grammars people lovingly cobbled together for decades kind of were outperformed, right? So we're in the revolution driven by research. Obviously, it's not something like building a pet store in some sense, but in other senses, it is like building a pet store or Uber, because you need to scale, but you also apply research. So I'd like, for you guys to kind of talk about what does it mean? What do you think about kind of the most interesting, the hardest part of building a deep tech startup, right? Where you want to win by applying really breakthrough science. And for James, how to find this, how to fund this, right? And as you said, isn't this progression from research to business plan? What are the pain points, right? It's obviously not easy in any order.
I mean, I can jump in. Oh, yeah, I can just jump in quickly. I mean, also just in reference to James's question. I mean, for myself, it was really driven by this urge to, in the problem space of like creating content and visuals, like that was something I was very intrinsically interested in. There's this kind of feeling of like, okay, there's so much like maybe storytelling or images in your mind that you want to project into the real world. How do you make that easier? And so the aha moment for me when I was looking at all of this research coming out of deep learning is that this is the key to that, but there's so much you need to build. And so even though maybe like figuring out who the initial super fans are and like who will be sort of the most, whose pain point you're going to solve first is going to migrate as you do more user research and actually build, ship, and learn. It was really driven by that product urge. And I think that's really what helps guides me as a North Star. I mean, the name Rosebud just comes from really just, it's not actually a Citizen Kane reference, though maybe that's the ultimate reference for it. But basically in The Sims, there was a cheat code, and Rosebud was how you get like 100 or 1,000 simians so that I could just stay and build my little virtual world. And it kind of felt like that magic, but like a lot more powerful.
And Lisha, when you looked at the trajectory of things, when you made this call, sort of how did you decide that this was something that was close enough that you can build something versus something that was too far away that you should maybe just fund some grad students to work on?
Yeah, it was actually really, the technical risk was the thing that I wanted to de-risk first. So in the beginning, even just like shipping something on mobile, even if it was kind of further away from, say, storytelling at large, I wanted to focus on faces because I knew digital identity was important. So actually the first thing I shipped was this like more simple makeup app. But once that was de-risked, it was like, okay, so models can be served in this way. Now it's kind of waiting for both the research to keep on getting better and then us to be at that forefront and then figuring out interfaces. So it was a combination of both the leap of faith and then de-risking that first. But later on, I realized it's always like the tech will catch up, but it's actually the product side that presents more problems that need de-risking.
Although I would just note that I feel like you're one of the first people to articulate to me sort of like an understanding of the architecture of the problem. And I think that like, although that's understood now, there's always this realization that in new types of technology, oftentimes the real question is not sort of, can I solve this one problem, but even just understanding what are the components and how do they string together. And thus you tackled different problems than sort of some random business person or someone who's too academic. And I think that was part of that mix of pragmatism and understanding what the structure should look like. That architecture question, I think, is something that you figured out. And it's just oftentimes misunderstood from teams that are too technical, oftentimes they won't ask that question from a pragmatic point of view. And then from folks who are like too business minded, they won't even think about it, right? And they'll just think that this is just like building a normal SaaS application.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree, especially with the latter point, because I feel like there was an unfair advantage in understanding where the research is now, but where its trajectory might go in a couple of years, and then anticipating like, okay, well, back in maybe 2018, that's when we first, or maybe early 2019 is when we first saw StyleGAN. It's like, okay, of course we're going to get better at manipulating these latent spaces and making a lot, easier to use. And then you can anticipate it's like integration into more traditional 3D engines. So it's like, what do you need to build in when that hasn't arrived yet, but to anticipate and move fast when these things will arrive.
That's right, because oftentimes people will talk about how brilliant Xerox PARC was, but it did take Steve Jobs to go visit them and say, oh, you know what? All this stuff is boring and won't happen for another 10 years. This stuff is going to happen in 3 years. And this stuff we're going to focus on right now. And thus we're going to build sort of their bad first GUI-based application product, the Lisha, and then build the next right one. But like that sort of ability to, see the big picture and then also figure out how to act, I think is sort of one of your unique strengths. And then now it looks like Merity is about to say something. So I don't have a natural transition, Merity, so you'll have to just talk.
No, so the hardest part for me in terms of deep tech is exactly what you two have said, which is that, okay, you have the research is hard enough as it is. You spend all this time de-risking the research, and then what you now have is a startup. And as we all know, they're incredibly easy. Like once you've de-risked it, you've then got all the normal problems. You're asking like, do I actually, what is going to get me towards product market fit? Can I actually do something that's scalable and repeatable? What moats do I have once this is all out? Once I've proven that the research can be practically used in the real world and shown what the problem can actually tackle, how do I make sure that someone doesn't come and steal my lunch? And so, even if you have all the right things in terms of when the research is, what it's leading towards, as Xerox PARC did or General Magic did, yeah, you're really hoping that you have the right skills or you can get the right people on your team to then push to that next level as well and make sure you can, keep your moat up and make sure that you're actually building correctly towards a future beyond taking research and putting it into the real world. And that for me is a real question as well, because I really enjoyed the way that Lisha has been approaching. As you said, you've de-risked it, and now in my mind, you're because yours is image and animation manipulation product. You've been exploring and seeing, well, increasing your luck surface area and pushing it out onto, say, TikTok, where it's a perfect testing ground for this thing. Because early tech for all of these things is a little problematic, but TikTok is also the perfect audience for that because I wish I brought my hat, but they're perfectly happy with putting a hat on, and then that's me as a secondary character, and I pull off and I'm on the other side of the room, and that seems like the perfect space for something like Rosebud to actually bloom.
Yeah, I mean, to respond to that, I mean, it was definitely a learning experience, and in some sense also not completely driven by the data and more a little bit by personal taste. But like at first I thought, more stable specs could be found about the product if I focused on businesses. But I found that in this particular area, they move not only slowly, but also they're a little bit afraid because it's synthetic media. And there's both this tinge of like, oh, are we replacing humans versus what I really want to push and see in this, which is like it amplifies our creativity. And so on the consumer side, you can just test a lot faster. I mean, the business model is a little bit trickier, but actually I think the things happening in Web3 and crypto, if we ever get there, is very exciting for that. And, finally we can creators might are kind of starting to have much better business models. But at least for prototyping and testing and figuring out where the pain points are, the consumer side has served me really well for fast iterations.
And, I just want to call out one thing that you said, which I think oftentimes gets lost as people develop ways to think about startups, which is, like, I don't know, there's data, there's lack of availability of data. And then there's the reality of like, you're doing this because you want to make a dent in the universe in a very specific way. And a big thing that I look for as a VC is, to be honest, like the will of the founder, right? And their desire to impose something, because I don't know, it's like kind of a terrible idea to start something. You could get a much better job as a researcher at one of the big companies and hang out and get, even now, very good food, even though under COVID is a little bit harder, right? It can be super reasonable, and, you don't have to commute anymore to those companies. It'd be really nice. And to me, like, the thing about the great founders is, like, sure, they're data driven or whatever, but they really have this burning desire to do something, right? And that willingness to impose your will rather than wait is I think critical and should not be underestimated, as we end up talking clinically or theoretically about starting something.
Yeah,
I completely agree. Yeah, sorry, go on.
I ended up leaving a very well paying position as an AI researcher, and yeah, it was exactly for that reason. It does help. I will have to say, like, obviously incredibly well paid, well compensated. And the fact that in terms of a safety net, like, the worst I can do is stumble and, like, return to big tech companies. So that does put you in a very different position. But the potential lost in terms of going out to start something of your own is in my opinion probably quite high compared to a lot of other industries. But yeah, the kind of will of founder resilience, burning desire, that type of thing, I feel like that is entirely necessary. But also it's one of the biggest advantages because as we're seeing all of these existing companies try to reorganize to work out what, like, an AI first company looks like, it turns out, communication is one of the biggest problems, and trying to reform communication at these large existing companies or reform the way that they tackle products, it's an impossibly hard problem at the best of times, let alone when you need to, reestablish the way in which maybe art is being mixed and matched. So copyright is starting to get a little more questionable. And if you have an existing platform, that's going to be a problem. Or convincing, the right people to give you $1 million in, hardware startup budget to go and tackle some of these strange problems.
So I have another question for Lisha.
It seems from the outside.
So, I mean, this raises another interesting question for Lisha. Like, I know when you were a VC, you'd have to ask people, so what's your moat? Blah, 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 right? As you're running day to day, how much do you think about questions like that?
That's a super realistic one. I mean, for the long term, I definitely think about it. It's more like a balance of the practicality of, like, shipping things fast. Like, you're probably not going to have the moat mechanism immediately, just because the bigger risk is, like, well, people even use this. Like, is this something that they want? And then, having a plan for the moat later on. So I guess, yeah, I mean, from, like, a, VC or even just, like, angel investing perspective, I think what you were saying about the hunger to actually solve this, because in all ways, it's, like, almost irrational to be a founder. There's too many ups and downs, like, maybe first 6 months is the honeymoon phase. And then it's just like, oh my God, like, the highest highs, but, like, the lowest lows. But it's just that urge to, like, okay, I want to build this thing. I don't want other people to build it, or rather it's more like, I have this specific vision. I don't think other people are building the right thing. And that's, because I was having a good time being a VC, honestly. It was great. There's nothing wrong with it. But it's just like I wasn't building Rosebud.
Right.
Yeah.
Have we taken this too far afield, Alexy? Did you want to guide us in some direction? Because I have a bunch of other questions.
Oh, this is very good, but actually I wanted to maybe make it a little bit challenging and specific, and also kind of close to my own heart by kind of asking hypothetical / kind of test question. So recently, right, I was running this conference full time. I built a business running this in the community, and I thought I'm gonna do it forever. And of course, a black swan of COVID happened, so I had to go work for the man. So I now work at IBM. And actually, what you described as a research lab, it's beautiful, right? My parents worked in research labs in Soviet Union, and actually, I find this extremely collegial. It's extremely collaborative, right? It's like university, but you're paid industry rate, maybe not Google rate, but it's still livable. And what's very interesting, right? So actually, I'm looking at the question was how do you productize large language models from the industry standpoint now? And so I'm very fortunate in the sense that I connect to folks like Stanford started this Center for Research and Foundation Models. So now we have this new fashion, right? And I talked to Merity about it before. So let's kind of look at the kind of current fashion, right? Which are large language models, right? So I think they kind of repeat like the deep learning cycle of a few years before that, right? But in a more narrow sense. something captures people's imagination in terms of deep learning, different things, but in terms of language models, human-like output, right? Something talks, something speaks, is there intelligence in there? So now we have GPT-3 obviously captured the imagination of a lot of people, OpenAI kind of, allied with Microsoft. So now we have startups, but I don't see any startups doing anything useful except marketing copy, which is low risk and kind of, you don't prove anything there, right? You can generate marketing copy. So, and obviously Merity is in the NLP state and Lisha is in the visual space, but I think you can use these models for hybrid. And James, you are in the VC space. So how do you guys look at this, right? So when you're the founders, right, and you see that this thing sweeps human imagination, lots of money is going to be invested. Some of this is going to be lost, maybe a lot, but maybe something is going to come out of this. As deep tech founders who understand this, how do you process this? Do you think I should do something in this space? Do you think obviously you're not going to compete with the Beijing Academy of Science. They already have almost 2 trillion parameters. And
Alexy, are you asking us whether you should start a company? Is that what you're asking us?
I'm asking you. So if with Merity, when you're looking at this, right, and you're in LP space, how do you think about this technology? Should I ally with this technology? Should I go against the grain? Should I do something different, or should I follow mainstream and do it better? And James, what do you think? Should you look for outliers, or should you invest in the mainstream and see who tweaks it faster, or does it something cute with this, but in the general vein of this momentum?
I'll start off by saying, when I left AI research to go and do my own startup, I had the option of raising a large sum of money, but I purposely shied away from that. And the reason is primarily that I don't think for a lot of these large language model startups that there is actually a good moat there. As we've seen, there's this fun game that, we release some massive language model, and then a year or two later, either an open source collective or another company or whatever else have released an equally terrifyingly large language model to compete with it. And the question then is, what do you have that is actually, what are you building towards? Are you just, burning millions to turn it into a few billion parameters that are outmoded in a year or two? And so that's why I've shied away from that. The way that I primarily look at it is, I think that it's entirely possible that you can kind of invert the problem. And whilst it's not in the language modeling space, it is a machine learning startup. Descript, if people have seen that, which is you throw in your video or audio and it will automatically overlay it with text, and you can highlight text and delete a chunk of audio. You didn't need a massive machine learning model for doing that audio analysis. And in fact, you could have started up with it very early. Yes, once you actually get to this good UI, UX feedback loop, you can start throwing in magical features by throwing these large scale models at them. But the real problem, and I think the question that I'm looking to answer is, where can you actually apply these things, and what can you then do with that? What justifies that multi-billion parameter, multi-million dollar language model or vision model or audio model? And for startups especially, you could raise the money and then use it for training this stuff, or you could just try and solve the problem that you're going to have to face once you've finished training model, which is how in the world do you actually use it productively? But I'm curious how James looks at it, because there's another option as well, like an Uber Lyftish angle of, well, you throw money into it and hope that you're picking the winning horse. And it may language models are certainly one of those things where you can keep throwing in money and get better results out. So one of the best options, at least, for putting in more capital.
Okay, I have so many cliches that I'll throw out, and then I'll have my actual answer, which is going to be another cliche. So one is, of course, in the long term, we're all dead, right? So you don't have that much time, depending on what you believe in longevity, you have and whether or not you're eating too much food, you have between 10 to 70 years left, right? To do something interesting. And so you could wait forever, or you can actually act right now. So that's one. The other cliche, of course, is I don't know, if startups never have moats. There's no moat. There's a ditch that you're going to dig really hard that you're going to hope means that the Huns don't come in and kill you, right? And so there's a little bit of you can't really dig anything that's you just can't dig anything really that deep. And then the third cliche, which is also true, is you don't know until you do, right? That there are formulas and then there's stuff that can only be figured out through computation, right? By actually sort of like doing something. And so I think that like for better or worse, sort of we're at that stage where the business models are unclear enough that we're still trying to do discovery. So we're not like dealing with vertical SaaS applications, right? With a vertical SaaS application, honestly, like the playbook is understood, sort of go and read SaaStr and you'll figure it all out, right? And the question is just, can you execute better? In this world, part of what's exciting about it is that we're still in the discovery mode. And we're still in the discovery mode, not just of technical architectures though, but also critically of business architectures. And so I think one of the interesting things is the only way you can play that game though is either by being very close to the market and have everyone talk to you, because everyone talks to Merity, right? So like that's one of his advantages of being where he's sitting, or sort of like building an early version of something with technology that, to be honest, probably will be commodified 5 to 10 years from now. Hopefully not 5 to 10 months from now, as Lisha's doing, right? In the case of Lisha, like someday, maybe it's her company, maybe it's someone else's company, they'll build infrastructure that makes it easy for normal people to do. But she's got this lead right now where she can then explore sort of consumer applications and consumer use cases and then figure out where she's going to go, right? And I think like that's sort of like the game that you're in the middle of playing. And then for you, Alexy, to be honest, like, I don't know, like unless you feel like you really want to starve and put your family at risk, you should, because some idea is so compelling or something just driving you crazy, then you should stay working and adding a lot of value at IBM, right? I mean, it's a great organization. They do good work. It's important stuff. Their TV ads are spectacular. Like you should take advantage of that, right? And so that's, okay. And then now I do have to tell you though, now as a self-interested VC, I'll tell you at least my dream, right? So I think that we're at the Baroque period of SaaS business models where like everything is well understood and it's all kind of boring and it's all sort of like diminishing returns. I think that we're at the beginning of folks figuring out business models related to machine learning. And I think that if you think about that relationship between how people build software and how they sell it, right? We've been through a number of distinct phases, right? Sort of like if you were to think about IBM building Sabre, which is the airline reservation system for American Airlines in 1960, American Airlines paid them equivalent of $300 million, right? To build that system. And they sort of ran it, but they didn't really make any money, right? And then if you think about Bill Gates and Microsoft, sort of Bill Gates gets paid whatever, $30 for every copy of MS-DOS, right? But then the thing is like he gets paid for the exact same copy of the exact same software. So his marginal cost is zero. And so like that's the most beautiful business model ever, right? That's why he can that's why he can pay people to kill mosquitoes. And so I think what's interesting though about that is like that shift in business model was not just because Bill Gates was grouchy and was able to impose his will. It was also because technical architectures changed and the way that software was delivered changed. And so then you go ahead to like, I don't know, whatever, 1994, when the first browser comes out, right? And you go to 2000 and you imagine like Mark Benioff being a good sales guy at Oracle saying, oh, no, like this whole like client server architecture is wrong. We have a ubiquitous client. We have like these data centers where all this stuff should sit, right? And then he says, everyone's freaking out about the fact that the data is going to be shared in these data centers, but don't worry, it's the cloud, right? Like it's like marketing architecture, right? Sort of like that, plus the fact that he's then able to convince people to say, hey, we should pay in a subscription business model, right? And like that, though, that subscription business model is not just because it's like fun, but it's because it reflects the technical architecture of the web. And it also reflects like some of the unique business openings that the web provides, right? This sort of always on, always delivered software. And I think something similar is going to happen with machine learning. And that there is going to be some, machine learning is so like, you guys forget this, but machine learning is so terrible and is so full of all these issues around munging data between different clients and people. And it freaks out normal people so much, right? And yet it is so powerful and is also so fiddly, right? And so what's interesting about that is like, there's some unique mix of marketing plus business model that fits that way of delivering software or benefits that's going to be interesting and it'll be dominant. And then like in 2040, everyone will be complaining about that business model the same way that I complain about subscription software. And so that's the search I'm on, right? I'm searching for that that guy or gal who's like likely going to be like stuck in Einstein, right, or stuck at Facebook as a product manager, and I think that's the big, as a VC, that's the big opportunity. So it's less about, and that's a person, right? That's a person who comes from a specific context with all sorts of biases and ideas, but also like this vision of what it should look like. And to be honest, I just don't know what it is, which is why I'm a VC and not Lisha.
Actually, I'm curious, James, what interesting business models are maybe hinting at what excites you about kind of like exploring new business models here.
I mean, I think, the obvious one, of course, is what's the best sort of like, well, how do you say this? Like the early, if you just say who did the best job of munging together user data and making a bunch of money off of it, right? And you say, well, obviously it was Google, right? Google did this spectacular job of sort of like create, like, I'm trying to figure out the right way to say this, like, sort of obviously search moved to like, the way they do search now is different than the way they did search before, right? But the way they did search before was like crazy collective intelligence problem, right? And so, sort of their ability to do it for free and then take that and sell it to other people is like sort of like that's like the classic sort of consumer business sort of collective intelligence business model, I think. And I think like that's probably going to be true until regulators catch up, right? But I think that, like, to be honest, like you look at how confused regulators are right now around dealing with the companies that are as old as Google or as old as Facebook, they're going to be confused for a long time. They're not going to have any idea how to deal with machine learning. So you're going to be able to get away with a lot, or I don't want to say get away with a lot. You'll have a lot of opportunity to innovate and try different things. So that's one. On sort of my world, which is a more B2B world, I look a lot at the data co-ops, right? All the different data co-ops who, sort of whether you're talking about, like, there are a bunch of healthcare ones, there are a bunch of like Fair Isaacs of the world, right? Where, or give to get models. And I think like those are interesting. And then there's like two radical ones that I think about that are sort of almost inverse. So like there's the insurance model, which is I pay you a little bit of money every day, right? In hopes that you'll be able to tell me that you protected me from something major at some point. And then there's the investment banker model. And the investment banker model, which is the most interesting one to me, and I don't know exactly how this could be software, how this could be, what you should do with this, but the investment banker model is, so I'm the vendor, you're the customer, I pay you money like every day for a long, long time. And then one day you pay me a lot of money, right? Basically, the investment banker is like, I will take you out to dinner, or take you that random thing, so that seems like it's a lot of money, but actually isn't that much money. And then one day you'll pay me $30 million for what seems like a weekend of work, right? Mm-hmm. And so those are probably like examples of the variation, right?
Yeah. Actually related to, I mean, both of you hinted at the commoditization of some of these models. So going on the very, almost like an extreme part of the spectrum, which is, okay, just assuming that there is no moat there. And actually, I think for a lot of these companies, it is like that. So like the whole sort of companies being built on GPT-3, actually in defense of them, I think they're doing a really good job just figuring out the productization of like where the pain points are. So yeah, sure, we start with marketing copy because it is a huge pain. And paying for GPT-3, especially if they kind of molded the prompts even if it's easy work, it's just molding the prompts and giving them a simple interface. That was enough to grow, for some of these companies from 0 to like 10 million ARR in a couple of months, 9 months or something. So I think the question definitely remains as to, okay, obviously then a lot of companies can do this, but having that head start, I mean, to your point, James, I think then you get a lot more interesting user data about, okay, what other entrepreneurial problems do you have? And then like when they can ultimately have the capacity to train their own models, et cetera, they can feed into that cycle. So moat is not a problem at first. Get that like right form factor for the product, get into and clearly validated by the actual money that you're making. And then I think there's like a bigger potential after that. So I do like that flavor of like company building, even if it is like against, me being a technical founder, it's like, okay, like they didn't have any expertise on the large language model side, but I think they did really well in the product formation.
That's a great point. I'm now looking at Stephen Merity.
Yeah, I think that have done a great job. Now, the question, I guess, for them is, I think the real genius of like GPT-3 was more along the lines of, as you said, like they didn't have expertise on the language modeling side. What instead they did was ask a huge audience, how can you make money with what we've given you, right? It not quite as a marketplace, like it certainly hasn't gone that far, but it certainly has like the first hinges of that. And you can imagine, I don't know, people releasing like prompt packs or something, because if I think where this theoretically fits very well is if your company isn't actually, if like language models aren't going to be your core focus, then you just want to externalize it. You don't want to have to pay incredibly expensive engineers for it. You don't want to have to worry about like the GPU architecture, the standard idea of electricity for beer production or whatever. Electricity is commoditized in that situation. The two questions you then have left are, if you are providing this as a service, if you're a GPT-3, how do you compete against, or how do you maintain that moat against, the, say, I can't remember the name of GPT Neo models, like these open source models, or from other companies like Cohere coming in. But that's a good thing for the end customer, because they rapidly have choice. So maybe we'll just see the flourishing of that field anyway, regardless of multiple competitors. Or the one that I'm particularly interested in is if, say, language modeling or machine learning isn't a value add in your company, if it's a core competency, how do you actually maintain that, and how do you grow that as your competitive advantage? Like what problems and what industries is it going to be necessary, either because you can't share that data, or because your problem is so specific, because they don't tailor towards the language that you're focused on, that you would actually need to have that as your core competency?
So let me push back on that. I'd say two things. I'd say, one, you don't need to know at the point, you don't really need to know the answer to that. You just need to be in the position and have enough resources to discover the answer for that. In the same way that if you were to look early days at Google, I don't know, they had exactly the wrong business models, right? But in part because they figured out like their product on the one hand was so technically innovative, but also so used by so many people, right, that they were able to gather the resources so that they were to buy the company or copy the company that figured out the right business model, right? And that ultimately, like, what's their real moat? Is their real moat that search is better, or is the real moat that consumers think of them first? Or is their real moat the fact that they have all these like very clever hooks into advertisers all over the world, right? But that all gets built over time. And then I'd say and then let me tease up one other distinction, which is you could choose to build on top of the language models, meaning you're building applications, or as you're suggesting, which I think is why you're so exciting, Stephen, is you're looking to say, you know what, that existing way that people think about these large models is basically wrong, right? And at some point, the world will figure out that basic, like that you have seen the future because you've lived the future. And at some point, people will figure that out. And while you're still playing around with that, what that world looks like, then you're willing to work in a relatively asset light way. And I think that willingness to say, I disagree with everyone. I disagree with whatever the latest marketing term from Stanford is, right? So like, I disagree with all that, and I'm going to keep on sort of going after the architecture I believe in. I think that's part of what makes you inspiring, and sort of why it's always fun to talk to you.
Yeah, it's the fun but very potentially high risk, which is exactly where you're supposed to be with startups. But I feel like it's a one area of research, which part of startups that shares with research, which is there's obviously a lot of good progress when it comes to the field of machine learning. Continuation of existing architectures, pushing forward transformers to these massive, amazing levels. But I'm always kind of softly traumatized. I was chatting with Alexy beforehand. And he was working on n-grams back in 2005 or something like that. And you jump back to that era, neural networks do exist, but they're not really used. SVMs and all these other things are king. And yeah, like there needs to be someone who really pokes and prods at the completely different direction to see whether or not there's just something out there. And I think that's where I really love, if we're talking about in terms of passion and everything else, like that's, if I work out one of these completely different far-flung ideas that actually ends up working, that will have me, hopefully, as a successful startup, but if nothing else, I'll die happy.
Right? I mean, there's a way, and you think about all the people who thought that mainframes were terrible and evil, and how long they were out of fashion until they weren't, right? Sort of like, and then that's one part, which is like long-term mainframes were the wrong architecture, but then they're the right architecture again, right? So like, there's a thing in which like also the other reality is like, I don't know, some things are cyclical, right? Some things are fashion, and they not fashion in the bad sense of the word, but they, like they move back and forth depending on sort of where the culture's at. So, okay, Alexy, have we convinced you that you should stay at IBM, or are you now sitting here thinking, I really want to be like Steven and Lisha?
As much as I kind of, had this idea for a while, I have 4 kids, 2 cats and 1 dog. I have a puppy, which is a big puppy. So I feel like, I am enjoying IBM thoroughly. I'm like, I just joined basically this, year. And so, but, so I'm very happy to interact with, scientific and startup and, industry and community. But, maybe I'll ask you, so there is a question actually from the audience, and I think it kind of fits with what we're talking about. So the question basically is, there is this cliche, there is a problem looking for a solution looking for a problem. And so normally VCs steer people towards problem, which looks for a solution, right? And so like all this traction. So other situations where solution looking for a problem is acceptable for
Of course there is. I mean, I think it's one of those stupid things that I'll say when I'm passing on a company, right? I mean, it's like, I don't know, like I'll say that, and do I really mean it? Maybe, kind of, sort of, but I think, of course, what's the point of a market? A market is a conversation, right? A market is a conversation between solutions and problems, and hopefully they match up, right? And so there'll be times when people are able to see such great solutions, or such, have some interesting angle, and they're just constantly running. You're just running around trying to find some match, right? And so you could be problem centric or you can be solution centric. It doesn't matter. Like, both can win, right? Both can win. This is not like, but so this is a case where you should never listen to VCs when they pass on companies. They don't know, they're all idiots.
Alex, really appreciate the radical honesty. But no, I mean, it's just hard to demarcate. So I agree. I guess as long as people are just talking to users, that would be my only one add-on. It's like, don't build in isolation. Obviously, a definition of user can be very different, whether you're building for researchers, developers, it could be yourself if you're very close to the user profile. But just don't build in isolation.
And I think, right, because that point is critical, which is, if you're going to build in isolation, you can do that. You can be a monk. That's a reasonable way to live, but it's not really the reasonable way to build a business, right? And so, because they are conversations, right? They have to be conversations between both sides. Otherwise, you'll never find the match.
I think the other interesting point for solutions looking for a problem is that sometimes the solution is what opens up the field towards actually having new and interesting problems, or problems that are suddenly solvable. Like one of James's favorite things is the advance in audio, like speech recognition. He has this brilliant video of him with his Google Pixel out and speaking in real time and having it fill in. And I think as a VC, he's pained because like you can see such a beautiful solution and it hasn't been applied to so many of these different problems. And yeah, like the fact that machine learning has opened up all of these different modalities, we really haven't scratched the surface. Like Clubhouse, we're still handling how to do walkie-talkies / like chat rooms for audio with Clubhouse. We certainly haven't done anything particularly interesting with machine learning and audio. But I don't know, James, what's your obsession with audio?
I think, as you say this, I have only one concrete piece of advice. Like, you should never listen to VCs about anything except for this one concrete piece of advice, which you should all go on Twitter and follow Ethan Mollick, Ethan, Mollick. He's a friend of mine who's a now entrepreneurship professor at Wharton, and he does nothing but publish like sort of like papers that have actually been validated for long enough that like are relevant to your life as someone who's thinking about starting something. And one of his great points is this reminder that like the technology is available, and then it still does take an actual human being to like adapt the technology and make it useful with some product. Like, it's not like these things don't happen magically, right? There's like money on the floor all over the place, just waiting for someone who's like has the gumption to actually build the right product and then go out to the market. And that person, sort of like, they're the ones who start companies and become incredibly successful. And hopefully one day we'll be able to convince, we'll be all going to Lisha asking her for money to, for some political cause or, to endow some chair from some university.
That's a great idea. Yeah, and actually, my degree is from UPenn, so I'm very, have very warm feelings towards Wharton. So I'll make a note, maybe, to stop by next time I go to Philly. That's, they're very well known for innovation and tech, right? MBA, like tech MBA, as well as some famous people went there. Yeah, no, this is great. So another question from the audience is, I think it kind of connects, and it's a little bit kind of vaguely framed, so I'm not sure what the exact kind of question is, but it's interesting. Why don't we yet have AI for communication? I wonder what this means, and maybe you guys can interpret it in any way you want.
Don't we have AI for communication? And aren't variations of that what Lisha's working on?
I mean, yeah, I obviously can like reinterpret this to talk about Rosebud again, but I mean, I think, yeah, just at least the problem space I'm most interested in is just how do you express yourself most intuitively. And in terms of, the thing that I lean towards is like visual. I mean, ultimately, Stephen also brought this up earlier, like language models are entering different modalities as well. And you just see that intersection so interesting. It's just because, people want to bring out and tell stories, and ultimately like online, their digital identities could be a lot more in sync with their, just like what's in their mind and what happens physically. So that's the problem I'm working on. I know there's a lot of other manifestations of that, even all the way to search. If somebody wants to take up Google search and replace them, I think that's another thing on large language models and communication. But
it's funny. I have a friend who go ahead, Stephen.
Oh, I see that as my interpretation of AI for communication is the way that I look at language models is that it's like you're staring into a fireplace. You see all these beautiful patterns and kicks and sparks. They're linguistic sparks that are flying up. They might give you an interesting idea or imagination, but generally, they still are and falling off of that. I think that is one of the.
I'm losing Stephen. Is everyone else losing
yeah.
him?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, but basically, like, I think a lot of the existing machine learning tech isn't actually advanced enough. Communication is one of the most intricate forms of back and forth that you can enter into with another human being or machine. We haven't reached that point where we can do that well yet. And I think the area that a lot of machine learning is in right now is that it's more the hallucination of communication. The images which give you, like, the linguistic sparks, if it's a language model giving you marketing prose that you then batch into something that's slightly more usable. Or in the case of, many of the most recent vision advances, it gives you that randomness that you think, okay, if I squint my eyes, I can see that angel in that picture where I asked for it to show me an angel. Like that is, I think, an interesting stage for it, but I certainly don't think we're a great point for like communicating with AI.
Okay, because I'll tell you at least my dream. Go ahead, Lisha.
Oh no, I was gonna, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I see that the people who are sort of, and maybe I'm interpreting communication a different way, but just even the whole swarm of GPT-3 companies, working on marketing copy, that's a form of just making it super easy to do a very narrow set of things, but making it easy because they are paying for it. And then on the side of even Descript, you mentioned, it's like making videos and audio clips like easy to kind of edit just like a script rather than having to re-record. I think those are meaningful progresses, and because it's like you don't expect AGI to help with that. I don't think, or at least that's certainly not my expectation of where these products evolve. And then of course on my side, it's like it's not meaningful if you're just like conjuring up random images, but it is meaningful if people are trying to, like how I think about where it's interesting in bottoms up game building is you have these like large Gaming studios obviously producing amazing stuff, but like how media is kind of evolving is having more and more of a creator class until the creator class is really blending into the audience themselves. And to enable that, you have to make the tools of creation far more accessible. And so I think when I interpret maybe communication more broadly, it's just like, what are we even doing in the internet, and why? What are people like? What do they want to communicate? Like, let's help with that rather than maybe replace them.
You know, Lisha, I think that's like a great angle, that sort of that notion of saying we want to create tools that make it easier for people to create things. I think one of the failure modes right now that you'll see often is the attempt to use AI or machine learning to come up with systems that are foolproof. Like, you know, sort of the moment you set up the problem like that, you call it AGI or you call it whatever, then you're basically just inviting people to find out ways to make you look stupid. And I think that when the emphasis is instead on creating user experiences that in some ways are more about training the user on how to use the product rather than coming up with something that is promised to be foolproof, right? The more you do that, the better off you're going to be. Sort of reminds me of like, I brought the Siri guys in many, many years ago to do a partnership presentation for their Series A. And it went super well until one of the partners basically asked the question about like how far away Pluto was. And of course, Siri didn't know. Like, it was not in the, like, they but the way that it was set up was such that it was promised to be this universal answer thing. And this is like 2007 or whatever, right? And of course it couldn't do it. And yet it was designed in a way to make people mad because they were gonna look for the boundary and then say, oh, this doesn't do what I want. As opposed to a system which is like the way the script is working, where it's like, it's really, I'm being trained how to use the script and I'm happy with it and it does what I need.
Yeah.
Okay, Alexy, have we convinced you to start a company yet?
We'll see. So I think there is one more question, which will be the last kind of in this main segment, and then I'll ask you guys for a kind of takeaway, one thought to take home, and after that you guys can go to a special chat. But the question is like this, to sum it up, essentially we have rise of new things in tech. So in AI, we see the growth of safety and ethics and responsibility. Now we have actually two talks. Clement DeLong keynoted from Hugging Face on AI ethics, right? So they have Dr. Mitchell, then and Ricardo Bezayates talked about responsible AI. So we have this one. They have sustainability. So people care about how much energy AI consumes, right? And also there are things like AI and power. There is a book called AI Atlas, which talks about AI being a tool of oppression and the instrument of the powerful. And so the question is, how do you think this affects the business of AI and technology in general? How does it make you feel, think, and adjust? Do you think this is a direction where the business will go? Is it something which kind of will change the nature of the business? I think that's the general question. How do you grapple with these new directions where society grapples with AI?
Okay, so everyone should buy Rob Reich's new book. I think it's called System Error. So Rob and Miran are friends of mine. I have this conversation with Miran often, which is, or I just had it not often, like this week, we've had this conversation, which is like, if we went back to 1950, when everything was written in sort of like sort of machine code, and then in 1951, someone writes a paper that says there's this idea of compilers. And then we're in 1951 and Grace Hopper writes the first compiler, right? Sort of what would be the sort of questions that you would have asked of Grace Hopper before she released the compiler or the program linker and then whatever the next, like, I think that in some ways, it's far better to think about that as the thought experiment than to think about right now, because it's just very hard for us to see what's right in front of our faces because we're in the middle of it. And like, I don't know, I'm bothered by whatever political situation's happening or whatever geopolitical thing. But if we stuck ourselves in 1950 and asked those questions and sort of said, okay, what are the limits that we want to place and not place? I think like that's the interesting question. And I would suggest that like there are like, it's just really hard to predict And by focusing maybe too much on the technology instead of the underlying values, we end up coming up with stupid policy, right? And so to me, I care much more about coming up with consensus around what are the things that we care about as a culture, and then using that sort of like that underlying set of principles that we can agree on to inform what people do, rather than sort of fight about specifics around ways that we should be talking about models or make them discoverable or not. Because I think like until like we come up with these broader underlying stories and like sort of fight about that, I think it's hard to, you know, sort of do this other exercise. And in some ways I worry a lot. I probably worry more than other, you know, so look, I'm a VC, so I've got my interest, right? So I'm probably more interested in experimentation than the most normal people, right? But I do worry about like sort of premature limiting of things that might turn out to be like perfectly fine, right?
I mean, that's such a good thought experiment. I'm going to take that with me, and because it just really places, I think, why it's so difficult to do this. I mean, I'm clearly a techno optimist. I'm like building stuff for the future, and I'm obviously, this is technology that's been talked about in very, I think, almost, yeah, it's like grayish ways. A lot of talk about how this is like not good for humanity. And I think I agree with James on that. Like we have to agree on the broader goals. And I think, you know, people who are optimists about tech are, you know, they're not trying to bring down like the fall of humanity. And it's also hard as a startup founder to have any goal outside of like what your product is doing. So as long as you're making sure, obviously, you care about these broader theses, but you're like focusing on building your product so that it both satisfies that, does no harm, and then just focus on building, like that's what you can do to actually bring forth like an effective change in the world. Like I don't think you should, as a startup founder, have like too many broad goals about like, you know, something that has nothing to do with your product. So
yeah, I don't think you can prevent the tech from getting out. And as James said about the Grace Hopper and the compiler, the one that I always think about was my father. When the first heart transplant was performed, he was terrified that that meant that, you know, the rich would live forever because they'd get organ transplants. He was a little too sci-fi on that, but that was a fear
forward-looking, a good imagination and forward-looking. Right. Clearly inherited traits.
But yeah, you don't want to borrow problems from the future, and you can't prevent this tech from getting out. The best thing, in my opinion, is just to get education and get as many people as possible as you can to be able to understand and be able to implement, play around, and extend these technologies. Because that's where, you know, society starts playing around with it and understanding it and working with it. And, you know, if we were thinking about like the postal system now, postal boxes wouldn't exist because there are adversarial attacks against them that are trivial. You know, like there's, if you're borrowing all these problems, you can get every problem in the world you want. Whether it works in society and whether society can help you correct the deficiencies is the real question. And I had a friend deliver the book. This is the book that James was talking about. I was part of the Stanford course with James and Bloomberg Beta. It is a really brilliant take on a lot of these kind of ethical questions and problems that technologies bring at us. So.
Okay, I have a third recommendation. So remember, it's Ethan Mollick, System Error, and my third one is there's this guy named Cesar Hidalgo who's I think in Europe now, but he was at MIT for a while, and he did this incredible thing which he doesn't even appreciate, in which he would do basically a moral census of how people think about machines, where he'd ask a lot of people questions about like, if the machine did this, would you trust it more than a human? If a machine did that, under what conditions would you trust it more or less than a human? And I think that it's like, it has limitations because it's only here in the US, right? But it gives you right now the best map of what people think about like the pros and cons of how people will or will not want to work with machines. And in part because morality shifts, right? Like, because as the technology changes, the economics change and people change, you know, what we are willing to do or not willing to do will shift. And I think like his book and the research that he and his team did, I think is like a really valuable contribution. And also for startup founders, it also shows you what are the holes in the market that you can take advantage of and where are the places that people will freak out.
Thank you, Jen. This is fantastic. So I think you fulfilled the take-home recommendation plenty, right? So you have 3 recommendations. So I recount Ethan Mollick, Cesar Hidalgo, and System Error. So these are your 3 take-home task, and everybody will be graded on this next year, guys, if you read this and what you thought. So Lisha, now give us your take-home recommendation.
Oh, sorry, I didn't get the memo on that homework. Maybe come back to me.
Okay,
see if I can think of anything.
So basically, this is kind of the closing recommendation each of you will give to the audience to think about. So Merity, if you have one ready.
Yeah, well, the take home I would say is from me and then from the other panelists. I'm looking at these very strange ideas and what the moats are for the future and what AI first companies are and how the feedback loops will occur. The one, and it's been hammered home to me in the past as well, but I think it's worth reiterating to the audience is, yeah, what is a head start that you can get before something commoditizes? How can you take advantage of that? Because for a lot of these deep tech companies, that's where you're at. Like the market, the field, the business models, everything are currently evolving. What's a head start that you can get? If you can't work out a moat, because as it turns out, you're going to be punched in the face and all your plans are going to go to hell. But what's that head start you can get so that you can hopefully build your own moat before commoditization?
Thank you very much. And Lisha, if you can.
Yeah, I mean, I have no specific resource to recommend, but the thing that's top of mind for me right now, because my users are creators, are just, there's so much demand right now to kind of better the monetization for creators. And it doesn't have to be solved by, say, NFTs, though I know that is sort of like the main, it's very hyped up right now. But I think the problem, though, why it's so interesting for me to kind of look at these Web3 things as well as other monetization strategies is because it's a real problem. Like, creators are not getting kind of their share of the kind of upside and what they're creating, but like we still enjoy what they're outputting. And on top of that, there's a growing creator class, and that all of us are kind of participating with remix culture. I mean, even with TikTok, eventually there's a spectrum where like most of the audience is actually participating by contributing. I think this also gets really kind of connected with your point, James, about like data collectives and like how do you reward contribution for your data. Here, like data is also just like contribution to content and curation, and I think that's all related. So I mean, just something to leave the audience to think about is maybe look at the things that are happening around NFTs through that lens, and not to port over things from Web 2 over to NFTs, and rather think about like how does that give the right structure and incentives toward more creators.
Thank you, Lisha. James, I didn't mean to kind of summarize your recommendation. If you have additional recommendations, please go ahead. Okay.
No, I mean you should use Rosebud. That's my recommendation.
All right.
Thank you.
That's very good. So I want to thank all of you guys. It's kind of the idea of this panel, I think, came on a whim, as everything by the bay, by watching Merity and James talking on Twitter and kind of knowing them. And, I think, James, I must admit, I didn't know how good of a panelist you are. And actually, I think you're an excellent moderator. So next time I'd like to invite you to moderate the panel. And also I want to commend you. You have this amazing, as a photographer, I can really admire your focus, because your photographic focus, because you're in focus and the background is fuzzy. This is like a beautiful Leica look. I don't know what you're using, but it's very nice. So really, really appreciate it. And thank you very much, guys. So if you like, for those who have time and inclination, you can go to a special chat, which is this immersive environment, see if people are there. It's lunchtime, so they may be already going for lunch break, but feel free to kind of walk around and see if there are folks who want to ask any questions. And until then, I'll hopefully we'll see you guys in the real world by the bay, by the food trucks next year, and in between at Bay Area. So definitely we'll invite you guys to speak. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you.